All right, our next session is on appreciative inquiry. We have a couple of experts in that field to join us. First of all, we have Gene Costello, who's the Southern Network Coordinator for 3CSN and Professor of English and Staff Development Coordinator at Fullerton College, and Lauren Service, who's the Northern California Regional Coordinator for 3CSN and a Professor of English at Santa Rosa. Welcome. Thank you.
Greetings. So we are going to just kind of take you through a little activity in the appreciative inquiry model. And part of why Matthew invited us to do this, we came and helped out the first round of training, and then we preserved that part of the session, is because he saw some real overlap between the appreciative inquiry model and the IEP way, and that this is a real strategy that can help you to have that open-minded, positive interaction with the college that you're visiting, right? So it's all well and good to say, oh, be positive, help make them comfortable to share the challenges that they're facing. But if you don't have a really specific strategy for laying the groundwork to have those kind of trusting conversations, they won't necessarily happen magically, so just being all smiles and listening is not going to make it happen, right? And that listening actually has to be preceded by some other things, right? I mean, listen to what? You have to know how to ask the kind of questions that are going to generate that fruitful conversation that can help people be reflective and move forward. So what you have in front of you, the little cartoon page, is a graphic illustration that shows you two models, kind of our traditional model and the way we tackle issues on our campuses a lot of times. And then the appreciative inquiry model is on the back side of the page. And then there's just an additional third page in blue that's just kind of another way of conceptualizing the appreciative inquiry model. And so Lauren is going to give you some directions for the next phase.
Good morning, and we'll also go out and get a few more copies and bring them in just in case not everyone has one. So we want to give you a few minutes to read the cartoons, and we want you to pay attention to two things. Sort of what are your insights as you're reading through the cartoons, and also what are your questions? What are you wondering about this appreciative inquiry approach?
And one other additional thing to talk about and think about when you're talking about your insights, what are you kind of learning? What does this suggest to you about what appreciative inquiry is also keep in mind, what are some things you notice that are overlapping between the AI and the IEP way, if we just want to have a real alphabet soup here. What are some overlaps that you're noticing between that way you've been asked to think and what you're seeing here? Okay, what I'm going to do, I'm going to have each table share one insight or question or observation about something you noticed that was common between appreciative inquiry and the IEP way. And I'll just go table by table just so that it's predictable for the video guys. So let's start over here. What's something you observed about appreciative inquiry?
Well, the idea that there's success, on the campus already, and that you can work from that place as a place to look for opportunities for growth and for change and to reaffirm the culture on the place.
So every campus has success already going on, right? So start from that place.
You asked for something we saw in common, although we certainly agree with the previous comment. We also noted that in each case, taking either of these approaches to an extreme would be out of balance. So you wouldn't want to be, oh, woe is me, nothing ever works. But you also wouldn't want to be, we never have any problems.
But I think it's important to remember too, right? I mean that the assumption with the letter of intent and the visit is that you know, there are issues, right? It's like nobody's trying to ignore that there are issues that need working on, but people's receptiveness to that sort of needs to that conversation, I think, right, has to be built on an acknowledgement that you're doing well. There are things that are happening that are good as well. All right, what about this table?
I think it's important, and I actually think one of the panelists said it earlier, but there are pockets of people on campus who have very different opinions about what's going on. And so the extremes are important to pay attention.
Right, yeah, that's a really good point.
Well, so we talked about using it and looking at how in the first model, a lot of our campuses may operate from that kind of a place. But if you are using it and looking at it as the glass half empty or the glass half full, it's attitudinal in terms of your perspective. So how are you looking at it? And so looking at the possibilities of things that could be and helping people look at it from that kind of a perspective.
I would add, we also talked about that the AI, is that the acronym, is very similar to the 6 essential characteristics and different definitions of what helpfulness is and what solution orientation are, different perspectives of those. And I would also add a thank you for actually doing the AI in this presentation.
You're welcome. How about this table?
So what we were talking about is that the advancement at a college is not so much some that things are bound up like on the first part. And that's in common with what we're doing with IEPI. We don't want to know about ancient traditions, that the way things used to tie things up. But also what's in common is that what we're trying to get the college to identify is they've brought an issue up. So dig into what works, and as we were talking about what works and what's successful, you get down the line so far, and then something happened. So what was it that happened? It probably wasn't some ancient tradition. It was probably something real, practical and knowledgeable. But the college itself had difficulty identifying where that success train stopped. And that's what we're after. We're after to get them to explore what it is that caused themselves to stop. It's probably very different from what our colleges do, but in some cases we'll be able to help them focus on successful behaviors that may be transplantable into the area where they're struggling.
Exactly. And if you look on that image where it says the one about appreciative inquiry, right, that it looks at obstacles as on-ramps to additional progress and additional work, right, instead of obstacles are going to stop you cold. And I think I like what this group was talking about in terms of, I like the idea of the success train, right, that there are success trains on every campus. And yeah, they may have run into something, but a lot of times when we're trying to identify problems, we just look at the obstacle, we look at the problem, and we don't explore, well, there was a success train. It was moving. How was it moving? How did it get where it got? And then how can we capitalize on some of those things, right? So that's part of the idea here, is that you raise the questions that help the college itself explore what was leading to the success train when that started, or when that's happening in pockets. Like one of the things that Joe mentioned was a college where they might have been struggling with SLO assessment, but he said there were pockets of success. There were pockets where that was happening well, where that was happening nicely. What's going on there? How do we build on that?
So what we were looking at, in addition to looking at the IEPI framework and the appreciative inquiry framework, we were also looking at the difference between the traditional viewpoint and the appreciative approach, and kind of struck by the difference between the bureaucratic approach, or the bureaucratic framework that's kind of typified in the typical approach, where you've got a more symbolic framework that's tied to the appreciative approach, where you're trying to change people's perceptions about the process more so than you're trying to change the bureaucracy right away. And that has a lot of opportunity for culture change.
And with that, it's interesting to look at the diagram of the process and think about sitting in this discovery stage, which is this first meeting, and being in this appreciative mindset that may shape different kinds of questions, and certainly listening for different things than if you're just looking for the problems.
Right, and since the second visit, as has been pointed out several times, is the place for having some conversation and discussion about possible solutions, possible ways forward, having this kind of conversation enables, I think, the colleges themselves to be much more active agents in that conversation, and produces a environment in which they can engage in that kind of metacognition about what's working, what's been effective, and like you were saying about perceptions of things. Like several of you mentioned that concern about feeling like, oh, I don't want to get sucked into the whole narrative of failure, the narrative of frustration. Here's where I'm coming from, and everything's so difficult, or we're not understood. But instead, if you can ask questions about, okay, so what is working? What are you doing well, or what's your perception of the strengths that are going on in your own college, and just kind of redirecting away from that focus on problems. Sometimes the colleges themselves need help to see themselves in that positive light, right? If their characterization or their perception of themselves is as this problematic situation, as this, college that's headed towards warning, we can help as teams, I think, them to sort of reconceive, and through questions, okay, but so what's going on here? Who was responsible for that? What did they do? How did that conversation take place? And even surfacing what this first table up here was talking about in terms of the difficulties and the extremes of perspective, right? I mean, that can be a positive, that there's an environment in which differences of opinion can be expressed. Right? Sometimes we think that that's conflict or that's difficulty, but sometimes that's a better place than all the disagreement shoved under the carpet. Nobody wants to talk about anything. Everybody's in their little silos. If there's an environment where those differences are being raised, a person could ask, how did you achieve a space where people feel safe to share disagreement without, strangling each other? Like, how did you guys do that? Like that. So you can kind of ask questions in that direction and help them re-perceive, what's going on in their area.
So we got a little off topic, but we did note that this negativity, how contagious it can be in a group when problem solving, and that you can, once you get this sort of downward spiral, you're done. And so but on the other hand, we talked about the need for any problem solving to be fairly structured, so that you also don't end up with just a lot of rah-rah and a lot of ideas that you don't know what's feasible and you don't know what direction you want to go.
Add that the energy level, just realizing or acknowledging the fact that any change will take time. So some other group mentioned earlier the need for balance. There's definitely a need for the balance on energy as well, that spread the energy so that the efforts can be sustained and remind folk when they're working on it.
Yeah, and that's a nice connection to that that item. I don't remember exactly what number it is, but about sustainability, right? Because I think you're exactly right. When something, oh yeah, we have all these ideas, we have all these solutions, but they haven't really been genuinely kind of developed in this process of positive conversation and real inquiry, then how sustainable will they be, right? Because people, part of what that model shows too is the way in which, in order to bring people in, and I love the insight that Joe realized about how important it was to bring those people to the table, bring the faculty, bring everybody on board to help in that conversation. If they feel they've been brought in, they feel they've been listened to, their work has been respected, right? We know you've been working hard on this. We're not just saying like, well, whatever you did is clearly a failure because it's not working and we need to do something else. That makes people just shut down and feel like, wow, I just worked for the last 5 years on this thing that sucks, right? Oh, sorry, probably shouldn't have put that on the video. Anyway, but honoring the work that they've done, right, and recognizing what they've contributed towards progress on their campus, that's how you get people to really be committed to further solution building, right? How about here?
You've talked about many of the things we did already, but one of the things that we believe is that these are not necessarily mutually exclusive, and that, as Bill said, our role is to help the college to connect those things that they're doing well so that they can see how they already have the skills and knowledge to resolve their challenges.
Well, we kind of did a little bit of a role play of imagining if you went to the college, and our college has some issues with planning, and I'm sure that might be ubiquitous across the room, and at our own institutions, because that's a challenging thing to sustain. But we talked about the fact that if you went in and said, okay, so are there any examples of what's going well with respect to planning? They might have something, oh, but the BSI is working really, really well. Well, why is it working really, really well? And then it was very interesting because you learn a lot more about just from what they choose, and then what's the reason, and what are their values, and what's their definition of working well. Because we've talked about, well, she said immediately, oh, it's because there's money involved. Well, that probably tells you, well, but that might tell you that their systemic planning is having an issue because it's not tied to budget. Yes, so I mean, I think that there's just more opportunity for learning if you ask that kind of a question, and that's what our first meeting is supposed to be. So.
Yeah, I like how you grounded it in a particular situation. That's actually part of Lauren's and my plan, if we have a little time, to have you think about, okay, given a particular situation, what kinds of questions would you ask? You demonstrated that really nicely. All right, this table.
Well, we talked about how in the image with the chalk lines for the traditional approach, that caught my attention. We've had an incident, so this thing with chalk lines has really popped for me, but that notion of working separately and independently in a traditional model to really highlight the ways in which the district is working collaboratively, not only for those individuals within the district connected to the issue that we're looking at, but how they're connecting to the colleges. And we also had some of the things that have already been said, but we had a really interesting kind of takeaway, so I wanted to have that identified. David.
So just the traditional approach certainly can be seen as constituencies at the college not getting along, taking a traditional approach, blaming and not finding solutions and so on. And the appreciative approach certainly can be collegial, people working well together, trying to find solutions and moving forward in a good direction to advance the college. And then also just that's the way that we plan on working as a team. And the speakers in the panel this morning talked about not bringing agendas, being objective, being fair, all of those sorts of things, being honest to look for things. And so if we do that as a team going in, and hopefully that will also rub off on the folks that we're interacting with at the college.
Yeah, so I like that notion of you as a team are exemplary to the group that you're working with, right? In the way that you recognize each other's strengths, right? So each of you, the teams have been created so you each bring your unique strengths and expertise to the team, right? So that is available for the colleges to use as a resource. But I think even in that situation, the issue, the question of how many classified people are part of teams. Can I see a show of hands? How many classified people are in the room? Okay, so a couple, but I know on our own campus, we've sometimes had the conversation about classified and respect for the expertise they bring to these conversations, and that sometimes it's really important to make sure that we create the ground for all that respect to be shared and for that expertise to be honored, and make sure that we are giving each other enough space to share those voices and to bring those perspectives to the table. So you're right. I think that's a really good point. We need to do it in our own teams, in addition to being open to the conversations that we have with the colleges themselves. All right, so I'm moving up here. How are we doing on time?
I just wanted to add, I think that sometimes we get stuck on just the appreciation part. And while I think appreciation matters, because we need to feel appreciated, we need to love the work that we do, we need to know that it matters, but this is an appreciative inquiry approach. And I think that the group in the back really did it well. That, when, I think there was the question of what happens when factions come after you, right? And they start trying to get you on their side. And that's really the traditional approach. I need to win this. My group says this is how all faculty should make all monetary decisions on campus. And I'm going to try to get everybody on my side. And what appreciative inquiry does is it has it step away from this issue to look at where has those monetary decisions on campus, where has that worked really well? And then asking deeper questions about how did they do it? What kind of infrastructure did they create? But having us really think about, here is this model that already existed here were the people involved, and they did it really well. What can we learn from that? And I think the other piece that appreciative inquiry does is it helps us really clarify our values, because I think in that model of where we're trying to win, our value there is winning. But really, the work that you're all going to be doing is helping faculty and administrators and the whole campus, all the educators, sort of look for what are they doing well and how can we replicate that in these different situations.
Yeah, so it looks like we do have a little time to do exactly what the table back in this corner kind of modeled for us so nicely, which is to discuss what kinds of questions would you ask in this appreciative inquiry approach. And I think Lauren's made a really excellent point, right? The inquiry part is that rigorous investigation. It's not just all appreciation. It's also asking those questions. But when you come from that place of appreciation and that's driving the questions, that gets people more engaged in that process of investigation, right? Instead of feeling defensive or feeling protective of what they feel like they've already done or already accomplished, right? So let's just play with the story that Joe was telling about, a college that was struggling to bring, sort of meaningful, genuine SLO assessment across the campus. It's existing in pockets, apparently, but in terms of a whole program for the whole campus and really meeting those levels of proficiency and excellence in terms of SLO assessment, there's still some challenges. So take a few minutes at your table to just talk about what kinds of questions might you ask of college representatives if that were the issue that you were there to help them investigate. Take about 5-6 minutes. Okay. All right, so let's hear some of the questions that you were able to craft together with your table. Who wants to share something they came up with that they would ask a team about this?
So I tried to just write down what was coming up in the discussion. We haven't evaluated and vetted all of this. So what areas or programs are doing well with assessment now? Might ask something like, and then who were the leaders in generating that? Or a broader question, could you tell us the story about how that success built, how it developed? Asking what people's expectations are about assessment and what they're communicating about it. Do you have examples of how SLOs have helped students learn better? So real examples of that assessment and assessment of assessment. And how do you know students are learning? The broad question, how do you know students are learning in your classes now?
Nice. Other examples people want to share? Ooh, that's an insistent ringtone, isn't it? That's very demanding. Answer me now.
to build on those really good questions, I think that what SLOs and assessment boil down to is that the people who are involved in the process find it meaningful. So you can ask the question, in what areas in campus have people found this meaningful, and what made it meaningful to them? Another part that could be related is, how is the college supporting these efforts? And so that might have something to do with adequate time spent on the task, with being able to actually respond with resource requests that emerge out of assessment practices. And then also, what our table is talking about is that if we recognize certain good practices in assessment, you can kind of embed them in the question. So a key part is the really interesting discussions that emerge out of assessment. So it's like, well, the people who are engaged in it, do they come together to be able to talk about these types of issues around assessment? So you try to embed the good practices within the question itself.
Who else? No? Did those two people summarize all the conversation that happened at your table? I mean, those were good responses, definitely. And this is just, it's something to think in an ongoing. I love that idea of embedding some ideas about best practices into the way you frame a question about what's happening at people's campuses. And even just simple questions like people said, who's involved? When does this happen? What time of semester or whatever, just sort of inquiring and investigating, what's the context for it happening in, and then that can help people identify where it's working, and then maybe what some of their own observations about what might not be working. And I think that's part of what you're trying to help people do, right, is identify things for themselves, not just you saying, okay, so we got all this information, and now we're going to come back on the second visit and tell you everything we think you should do. It's helping their own sense of themselves emerge.
Well, it just sort of dawned on me. I'm a little slow learner, but I think in elementary school, and when we learned how to read, it was the what, where, why, how, and when. It seems like, and who. So you can tell it's been a long time since I was in elementary school. That's age discrimination. No, but in any case, I think the why, in other words, where's it working well? What's responsible for it working well? Why do you think it's working well? So thinking about the reading questions as you ask.
Nice, which are also the journalist questions too, right? So if you're just trying in this first visit to get kind of a descriptive picture of what's happening.
Well, this is kind of from my perspective as a college president, but I think a good question would be, what does the college do to display that this work on student learning outcomes has value? For example, I give presidential awards in 3 areas for SLOs, and I present them at Convocation Day and have one of the people speak to the faculty about what works for them. So that shows not just that there's a process going on, but that it has value to the college. Because our college question is, how do we really make this work? We do all of the required accrediting reports, but we are struggling to say why this really has value. And one of the ways this shows that it has value is that the college has really visible displays that it has value.
And that might even lead to a little bit deeper conversation about, well, what does your college value and how, right? And sometimes that discussion of value doesn't get much farther beyond, compensation and compliance and things like that. But I think what you were talking about goes a little deeper in terms of, let's honor the value in a different way, right? One more.
We also thought it might be useful to relate the SLO process to other processes at the college. So some of the questions we were thinking of were like, how does your SLO process fit into larger processes of institutional effectiveness and continuous improvement? What aspects of the SLO process actually work really well, and maybe you'd like to replicate them in other processes? And are there other processes that maybe the SLO process could learn from at your college?
Yeah, and it was something that Matthew mentioned when we were just chatting as you guys were working, is also inviting people to think about, well, why does it work the way it works right now at your campus? You know, that there were good intentioned plans that led led the campus to where they are now, and sort of digging in a little deeper and trying to find out, what's behind that and the way it exists now, because those intentions are still there. Some of those shared values, as Lauren talked about, are still there. And how do we translate those maybe into some new and different practices? So just as a closing, I mean, we were going to do kind of like a summary, but I feel like you guys totally get it, and this seems like a really great summary. But I was just going to sort of draw a connection with my own professional area of expertise, which is writing instruction, and just say that this is a lot like a student writing center visit. They bring a draft, right? And sometimes the students will bring a draft and they'll say, I just need some help on the grammar. And so when people were mentioning the fact that sometimes in that letter of intent, the expressed problem or issue that people want to work on, when you get to that campus, you may feel like, oh, there's something else going on here. And I realized that reminded me a lot of when I work with students in the Writing Center. And they say, I just want to work on the grammar. And you start reading their essay and you think, oh yeah, grammar's the least of your worries, sweetheart. But obviously you're not going to say that, right? So you start asking some appreciative questions about what you see going on in the paper, what's working in the paper, but trying to get the student to articulate a little bit more effectively what they're really thinking, what their main idea might be, those larger, more important kinds of questions. And your role is not to evaluate when you're in the Writing Center. I mean, I'll get students sometimes say, so what do you think this paper would get? Do you think, is this a B yet? What do you think my teacher will give me? I'm like, that's not my role. There's a difference between evaluation and feedback. And feedback is all about using that process, giving them something they can work with, right? That notion of formative feedback that they can build on, use for improvement, right? And that's different from straight up evaluation. Here's how you performed, right? So I just leave that with you as a closing analogy from a writing instructor, and hope this was helpful. I'm going to give the mic to Lauren if she wants to add anything.
Just to say thank you for engaging. And I know that, these are really great discovery questions. And so we do go back to the hard stuff, right? And part of what we do is lead them through this appreciation of what really works. Now, how do we dream how this issue, or whatever the problem is, how do we dream up what that could look like? And then what do we actually do to achieve that? And I think in having this process, we really clarify our values. And so we know we're doing this work together because this matters. And so whatever we create out of that process will be powerful because people are engaged. And they've generated that together.
And then that's what enables sustainability.
All right, thank you.